Good morning. We begin today, as we did yesterday, with a heavy heart, with our minds and our souls preoccupied with the violence in Israel, Palestine. I think studying the Book of Judges brings home even more the culture of war upon which our Jewish tradition, as well as traditions of all of humanity, is based. All of our histories and all of our stories have war in them. Maybe not all, but most of the ones that I'm familiar with. And again, the part that the book of Judges, together with Joshua, played in inspiring the early Zionist thinkers and those that moved from Europe, especially, to the ancient land of Israel. And as conflict grew stronger and stronger towards 1948 and to this very day, these stories are in the background. Now, I'm not blowing it out of proportion to say that this is why there's a war right now, but this constant cycle of up and down of peace when the Israelites are observing God's words and war when they're not was one way of understanding the wars of the past. It's clear to me that's not, at least the way it's presented in the simple meaning of the text, the way for us to understand the violence right now, other than the fact that there are consequences for our actions. And if there's one moral that comes out of all the book of Judges, is that there are consequences. We're going to see that today. Regardless of how those consequences come about, the consequences come about, whether it's through God or whether it's through human interaction. And what is happening today is not the product of one court case or one area of residences in Eastern Jerusalem. It's not the sole outcome of the end of Ramadan. It's not the sole outcome of a prime minister desperate to keep his chair and willing to even go to war. It's an outcome of all these things together. And each of us will see it very differently. We'll see what the ingredients are and what the percentage are of what it affects, but consequences. And the fact that for so many decades, we have made no progress, especially in the last decade, no progress whatsoever in conversations with our neighbors, and thought that status quo could be maintained. I think this is an indication for all to see that status quo cannot be maintained. And while some of us might reach the conclusion that, well, this proves that there can never be peace, for someone like me, this proves that there can never not be peace. There can never be, we can never be satisfied with a status quo in which one party is constantly subdued by another party. And that goes not only for Palestinians in Gaza, regardless of Hamas's declarations to wanting to wipe out the state of Israel, but it goes for those who live in the occupied territories, wherever those territories are, and it goes for Arab citizens of Israel, or Palestinian Israelis, as some of them wish to be called, who are most definitely living as second-class citizens. From a statistical point of view, absolutely. And so all those things have come together in a perfect storm, showing us just how imperfect our approach to the situation has been. So I'd like that to be in the background of our study today, not theologically saying that because our people are not observing the laws of the Torah, this is what happens. God forbid, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that there are consequences. That's all. So let's get to the study. And Madalena, I think I have a feeling perhaps you muted everybody. Just make sure that people are unmuted so they can talk, and I'll click individually. But I do ask you, especially there's someone that keeps their microphone open, And it's nice that you're learning Torah from other people. I do appreciate that. But there's always seems to be some other rabbi or teacher filling in the noise. So please be careful what noise you have, what sound you have on, if you're going to unmute. All right then. Of Burros and Boroughs. Our main focus today will be on a prophet that perhaps you never even heard of until now, Yair. That'd be the main focus of what we do today, but we're entering a part of the book of Judges where we're introduced to two of the five minor judges. Yes, there's such a thing as the major judges, the minor judges. That's not a biblical distinction. That's not a rabbinic distinction. That's a modern a distinction of modern biblical scholarship. And there's a lot that goes on behind it that would reach the number 12. It's not all that important for our study, I think, but it's part of, for those that are studying the history of interpretation of the Bible from the late 19th century onward, it's one of these key issues of 12 particular judges, and these five make up. For our purposes, though, we want to just point out there are some judges, we've already met some of them, like Othniel, in which very little is told. And we can imagine there were more stories, but for whatever reasons, we don't have the stories here. We have a case which is very much like that to begin with today, and then we have a case where there is a little bit more, and then the early midrash, the early biblical or the retelling of the biblical story has a lot to say of it, and that's what we're going to look at today in a text from the 1st century BCE. Okay, so Harold, do you want to start us off, please, with verses 1 and 2? Remember, we're after the stories of Avimelech and the horrible relationship that he had with the people, the consequences that were paid there as well. The last thing we did, I think, was that he, well, no, it's not the last thing. Let's just go ahead. Go ahead, Harold. Go ahead.
After Avimelech, Tola, son of Puah, son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, arose to deliver Israel. He lived at Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim. He led Israel for 23 years. Then he died and was buried at Shamir.
Okay. So anybody ever heard of Tola before?
No.
I never heard of Dodo.
Dodo. Well, so Dodo is actually the easiest of the names to understand. Dodo is, first of all, the vowels are always suspect because that's how the Masoretic dotted the text. It could be do, dodo. But that, of course, is similar to what name?
David.
David, exactly. Right. David is Dalid Vav Dav. Dalid. This is Dalid Vav Dalid Vav. And the root of this word is love. So it could be a shortened theophoric name of love of God, God's love. The same name that Solomon, David's son, is given, the other name of Solomon is Yedidia. Yedidia. That's also Yedid, comes from that same Dalid Vav Dalid root. It also means uncle. And that brought some of the interpreters over the centuries to say that there was a blood relationship between Avimelech and this particular fellow as well. But it seems probably that this is just 3 generations: Tola, Puah, and Dodo. So Dodo, we understand that name. How about Puah and Tola? Anybody? That's a little bit more difficult.
Puah was
a midwife.
one of the women early on.
Right, one of the midwives, right? In the beginning of Exodus, that's a woman's name there. These names, both Puah and Tola, they do appear in the Torah, so they're in that same family of the Issacharites. But the word Tola, like think of Tolat in Hebrew, those that know Hebrew, is a worm or something from the snail family. It's what you make crimson from. I don't know how crimson was made in other parts of the world, but in the Middle East, it was made from a particular kind of worm. And Puah is a particular kind of shrub from which a red dye was made. So I like the suggestion of one of the commentators says that perhaps they came from a family of dyers. That's Kaufman, the Israeli commentator. That this is he's a family of people that dye textile people, perhaps because everything's in red. I don't know. I'm not sure it mattered. We would help us understand the story anymore. Other than this is part of the art of the narrative, right? To have names that are it may be part of the mnemonic. It may be a mnemonic device as well. It's easier to remember things. Now people remember, oh yeah, the guy whose name means a lot of red, and he's the grandson of a dodo, right? And we think of a dodo bird perhaps. But the most important word here for me is vayakom achrei Avimelech lehoshia et Yisrael, and after Avimelech rose someone to save, to deliver the people of Israel. And of course, all the book of Judges is about deliverance, about Yeshua or redemption. Geulah's redemption, Yeshua's deliverance, slight differences, but perhaps it's important. So we don't have anything else about him. We don't, in general, we don't know much about the tribe of Issachar, landlocked tribe in the north. But that's what we have for the opening story, the first of the minor judges. Any questions or comments?
I have a question. It's actually a language question. When you say that David comes from the word for love, I don't know very little Hebrew myself, but the word for love that I know of is ahava. Is that related or totally different from this David?
Well, it's related in that they're similar meanings, right? There's always synonyms in every language, right? So
Right.
ahav is a synonym of daled vav daled.
Okay, but in
It's just-
ahav, there's no dalet, right? In ahava.
No, they're two different words. They're two different
they're
words.
two different words. Okay.
And they have the same meaning. They come from the same semantic.
Right. I mean, I know they have the same meaning. So is it like, love and in English, love and adore, something like
Yeah,
that?
something like that. I mean,
In other words, they have different roots, but
Right.
okay.
Right.
Okay, so they have different roots, but mean the same. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Dodi is my beloved is to me.
Right. Dodili vani. Yeah. So in the Song of Songs, that it's a series of erotic poems, or some of them are erotic, but love poetry between a man and a woman, and he is called the beloved. Anila dodiva dodili. I am for my beloved, and my beloved is for me. Yeah.
Okay.
But dod also means uncle in Semitic languages, so that complicates things a little bit.
Okay.
Okay. All right then. So Trudy, you want to go ahead 3 to 5?
Sure. After him arose Jair, the Gileadite, and he led Israel for 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode on 30 burros and owned 30 burros in the region of Gilead. These are called Havoth Jair to this day. Then Jair died and was buried at Kamam.
Okay, and this is it. These verses, these few verses are what we have about this guy whose name is, I'm going to pronounce it as we would in Hebrew, Yair. Yair. So before we get to his name and the interesting amount of sons and donkeys involved in cities or towns, if you look in the Hebrew, the first section was Vayakom achrei Avimelech, and then arose after Avimelech, and here is Vayakom achrav, and arose after him. So Vayakom arose, what's intended here is that God caused to rise. That really can't be doubted, that this God is behind the scenes here. God gives rise to another afterwards, and his name is Yair from Gilad. Gilad, the area in Transjordan, the east bank of the Jordan, the area that was not originally intended to be in the Promised Land, but was extended through contact with the tribes, with 2.5 tribes, and Moses at the end of Numbers that we'll get to on our Wednesday study sometime in the near future. But for now, though, let's just talk about his name. Anybody recognize a word that you know in Hebrew from Yair?
Ya'ar. To get up in the morning.
Well, that would be air. That would be with an
Aleph.
ayin, lihit orer. That would be with an ayin, lihit orer. Air.
You mean-
Isn't Ya'ir written with that's Ya'ir is written with an aleph.
This is with an aleph. Now you are right though in that there is it's called onomatopoeia. Help me out. Onomatopoetic.
Onomatopoeia.
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 Right. Well, that's the noun, but it's the adjective is onomatopoetic, I think, something like that. Let's just call it wordplay right now, okay? That mischak milim is we use in Hebrew, or lashon nofel lashon, a language that falls upon language. We've had a number of examples, so this is an example here, a really wonderful one. His name is Yair, and we're going to hear about Arim and Ayarim and Arim, or Ayarim and Ayarim. So the R we have, that's from an assonance, it's the same. But the word Yair comes from the root Aleph Vav Resh, which is or, light, right?
Okay, so it's he will bring forth light.
Right, or God is my light. God will light up my light. If could be a shortened version. We usually assume that these shorter names are shortened names, theophoric names that have the one of the names of God in it. So Yair El or Eli Yair or something like that. You know, my God is my light, and those are words, those are phrases that we know from poetry, like in Psalms. But let's say the words that you know from those of you that participate in the Shabbat morning prayers, Yotzer HaMeorot. We say that's the blessing. That's the end of the first blessing before Shema. We thank God for creating the lights. Meorot, Yair Meorot, or Hamavdil ben Kodesh lechol ben or lechoshech. We at Havdalah we make the blessing between sacred time and secular time, between light and dark, or lechoshech. So Yair. So that's that, and there's something poetic about the name in that he brings about light as well, right? He for quite a bit of time as well. He's out there for 22 years. For how many? For 22 years, he brings light as well. You might want to see that as well. But then there's this wordplay with the other things that came afterwards, right? So we're told that he has 30 sons. So he's starka bocher, right? He's a strong young man to have 30 sons, and they are riding on 30 colts, donkey colts, meaning that they were aristocrats, they were nobility, and the word that's used here is ayir. An ayir is a cult, so ayarim in plural, and they had 30 towns, which in singular is ir, in rabbinic Hebrew, and afterwards it becomes ayarot. And whether the language is correct or purposely incorrect, what is clear here is that there's a play on words between Yair and ayarim, that whole R thing going on. Again, could be just could function in the beginning just for the mnemonics, for people to remember this as part of the oral history, or it just could be the playfulness of the narrator here, as it is in other places as well. Okay, now finally he dies, and he's buried in a place called Kamon. Kamon. So we're going to get to that in a second. In fact, why don't we take a break from the biblical text now, because this is what our main focus today is on Yair. And I have mentioned many times my friend and teacher Yair Zakovich, who wrote one of his first articles on Yair, and I couldn't find it online. And I remember, and I'm sure, and I know that the first time I learned this study was I studied this section was with him. I couldn't find it, and there is a book that has a chapter about this, and I have it someplace in a box, I think. so I couldn't find it. So I would have more to say, but with the gist of what he and Avigdor Shenan, his good friend and also my teacher, what they argue on a text like this is that what we have in the Bible is a small amount of what was known at the time, and that sometimes those traditions, they survive onwards, and it's just telegraphed in the Bible, and then it sprouts up at a later date. How late? In this case, 1st century BCE, which is when we have or first century, let's just say 2020 years ago, let's call it right now, okay? And that is this text that we've seen before, pseudo-Philo. It was once, people thought in the beginning it was Philo. It's not Philo of Alexandria. It's called Biblical Antiquities, if you look for it in other places. There's the translation that's on the page, on the second page here, is something I got off the web. It's an older English, and it's not as academic or as critical as the translation in Charlesworth, which is what I brought on which is the Xerox or the scan page. So if you go to the third page of what you have today, is everybody with me? People have the text?
Mhm.
Okay. All right. As usual, if you don't have the text, let me know. Sometimes I can just throw it up. But so this is a little bit, this is the chapter about Yair. And let's read it through. And as we read it, make notes to yourself what strikes you here, what comes from the biblical story here, what might be influenced by other biblical stories, and how the author of this text kind of continues the tradition of the biblical author. So Dan, could you read this for us? 30. So this is what's called in Charlesworth's text pseudo-Philo. By the way, this comes from a wonderful 2-volume set of ancient pseudo-epigraphical material. That is, it doesn't have the apocryphal books in it, the big ones that you know of Tobit and Judith and Maccabees. It doesn't have it has the ones that are the next ring out, the ones that were still considered sacred in some places, but they didn't get into the canon of Alexandrian, what we call the Septuagint, the Greek translation that was the Alexandrian Jewish community's canon right before towards the end of the first millennium. But they were out there. There were other texts out there. So really fascinating, some really wonderful texts. And this, of course, is one of the best, the pseudo-Philo. Go ahead, Dan.
Yair built a sanctuary to Baal and deceived the people, saying, "Everyone who will not sacrifice to Baal will die." And when all the people were sacrificing, only 7 men were not willing to sacrifice. Their names are these: Defal, Abiezrel, Getalibal, Salumi, Ashur, Yonadadi, Memihal. They answered and said to Yair, "Behold, we are mindful of the commandments that those who were before us and Deborah our mother commanded us, saying, see that you do not turn your heart to the right or to the left, but pay attention to the law of the Lord day and night. And now why do you corrupt the people of the Lord and deceive them, saying, Baal is God, let us adore him. And now if he is God as you say, let him speak as God, and then we will sacrifice to him." And Yair said, "Burn them in the fire, because they have blasphemed against Baal." And his servants took them to burn them in the fire. And when they had put them in the fire, Nathaniel, the angel who was in charge of fire, came forth and extinguished the fire and burned the servants of Yair. But he let the 7 men escape in such a way that none of the people saw them, because he had struck the people with blindness. And when Yair came to the place, he was burned with the fire. And before he burned him up, the angel of the Lord said to him, "Hear the word of the Lord before you die. And these words the Lord says, I have raised you up from the land and appointed you leader over my people. But you rose up and corrupted my covenant and deceived them and sought to burn up my servants with the flame because they chastised you. Those who were burned with corruptible fire now are made alive with a living fire and are freed. But you will die, says the Lord, and in the fire in which you will die, you will have a dwelling place." And afterward he burned him up And he came to the pillar of Baal and demolished it and burned Baal along with the people who stood by, that is 1,000 men.
Thoughts? Before I tell you, share with my, what strikes you about this piece?
Well, I'm just wondering, in what we read, there's no reference to him not following the commandments.
So we have a case of one story, one tradition has a absolutely positive fellow, maybe a little bit, overdoes it with the amount of sons he has, and they're all driving Cadillacs. Maybe that it's hinted at there's something wrong with that, but seems like a perfectly good savior, right? A deliverer. And then we have another tradition that is totally the opposite. So Trudy, I don't think you should be surprised. I mean, all you need to do really is to just flick on and toggle on your TV set between Fox and MSNBC. Or on your Facebook feed today, if you have one like mine with so many Jews, literally thousands and thousands of Jews and Israelis and Europeans, and where lots of the Jews have a frame around their face saying, I stand with Israel, and lots of them have a frame around their face saying, Arabs and Jews want peace. It's a different, the same things happen. It's one event is happening, yet it has very, very different outlooks. I think it's one kind of big meta lesson here that we might learn from this. What else, folks?
It's okay.
I understand from past experiences that some people say that King David was the great king because he provided the largest for the people of Israel, and then Solomon came along and spent it all. So, and then there's people who say Solomon was the wisest and King David was. So there's nothing that everybody agrees on.
Yeah, that's true, Sid, but this is a little bit different because the author of Pseudo-Philo only has a negative tradition about Yair, whereas the author of the book of Judges, given it's earlier, only has a positive, right? So what you're referring to, whether it's the Talmud or later Judaism or even the Hebrew Bible itself, there's a mixture. There's a mixture of motifs, which is usually what we get. We get a mixture because that human beings are a mixture. But what's really interesting here is that it's really one-sided. Both.
Yeah,
both
this is
ways.
one-sided.
Okay. Anybody else?
I was just wondering what Dvorah was doing here.
Right. Of all the people to quote here, those seven they quote Dvorah. You'd think that they would quote Moses, for instance, or maybe Joshua. I think because it's in a section about the book of Judges, and I like that about this. Usually that stands out here when we think of who people quote on my rabbinic feed of, or it's actually an email list that I'm involved with progressive rabbis. People are asking for prayers for peace that have been written recently, and somebody said, you'll notice that all these prayers that are being published, they're all written by men. Okay, so somebody wrote today, said this one has been written by a female rabbi. What was the case today is the case then as well, is that the people that are usually quoted are the men. And so this stands out as a woman being quoted as an authority, as a source for law. Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, she was the closest, I guess, in this same period.
Not the closest, because there were others that came out. Avimelech would, Yerubal was kind of a good guy, and he could have been quoted, I guess. But on the other hand, also she has the long song, right? And so that would be a source of Torah as well. Okay, good. How about the plot of the story? What had this burning thing? Remind anybody of anybody? Anything?
Yes.
What does it remind you of?
It reminds me of Maccabees.
Okay,
Seven.
okay, or perhaps Daniel, are you thinking?
Yeah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Right, so Daniel, which was written in the time which was certainly edited in the time of the Maccabees. So yes, this kind of this torture, but there's also another story that is first found. It's first found in Pseudo-Philo, but we know it from the Midrash as well. Anybody?
Is there a story of Abraham in the fire? It's
Right,
in Midrash?
Abraham and Lot. Right, Abraham and Lot. And what happens is in Nimrod, and the source of that, the earliest source we have is in Pseudo-Philo as well. Nimrod, who not a lot is talked about in the Torah itself, whose name hints at rebellion. He's the organizing engineer and architect of the Tower of Babel, Migdal Bavel. And in order to build Migdal Bavel, he instituted that everybody had to, they all had to make bricks themselves and put them in the furnace, and they had to put their names on the bricks. You know, like at one of these a place that has the funders, their names are on the bricks and or on the top, you know, those kind of things that we know. So each person had to have their name on a brick, right? Talk about getting people to take responsibility for a project, right? And also to share for the consequences, right? You think you're going to know it, we're all in this together. And Abraham said he's not doing it, and so they threw him into the furnace of the bricks. And that is a play on words from or that comes from the fact that where did Abraham originally come from? Avram, anybody remember?
Father of many.
Ur Kasdim, from Ur of the Chaldeans.
Yes.
And Ur, that same root, Aleph Vav Resh, means light and fire. Ur Kasdim. So that's a play on words. And the same thing happened here as well. Where was Yair buried? What's the name of the place?
Come on.
In Greek, the word kaminion is furnace. And so the same thing has happened here as well. The author here, whether he invented it or whether there was a tradition before that, obviously people that knew Greek, otherwise it wouldn't have come up. So this motif of being burned in the furnace and being tested in the furnace, it's here, it's in a few other places as well. And I would imagine if we were to go out into the world, we'd find the same kind of ordeal, you know. All right. And then there's one more thing I want to talk about here, and that is on the sheet right where the number 4 is. So it's kind of like verse 4. The first word there right before is blindness. You see that? Struck the people with blindness. The term for someone who is the Aramaic euphemism for a blind person is sagi nahor, somebody with lots of light. That's a in other words, you say the opposite in a euphemism. And it reminds me of my days at Hebrew University in the 80s, and there was a student who was blind whose name was Yair, who I assume was blind at birth, and his parents named him Yair for that reason. And yeah, it wasn't always easy. He would most often fall asleep in classes, and you could see he was falling asleep, and then he'd wake up and make a comment right away to whatever the lecturer was talking about. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of biblical verses, which was very impressive at the time. So that was Yair. Yeah, Yair Ha. And he tormented Yair Zakovich as well. I mean, Yair Zakovich had a hard time with him, I think. Okay. So I think that's it. Anybody else want to make a comment?
I have a question. What are the marginal notes? Because they don't seem to be related to the text they're next to. Are they?
Sure. The one on the right, the first one, that's the section that the story is based on in Judges. Can you see that?
Okay.
Okay. And then
so it's referring back to something we've already read.
No. This is
no.
No, think of this like
we're in chapter 10.
Yeah, we're okay. Yeah, but this is not. Think of this like I see. Okay. Like a publication, an edition of the New Testament. Some of them they often have the verses on the side. That's the style here. And then if you go down
I
to the
see.
one,
Okay.
the one that where Sasha said it's interesting that Devorah is quoted, except for the quote is from Deuteronomy, right? So she's quoted saying, and then beneath that is what is in Kings, that section.
Isn't that Eliyahu and Balaam at Mount Carmel?
Exactly. Right. The punishment of Nevi'eh Habal, right? So this comes to show, I mean, these side notes here show you the connection between scripture. That's it. And by the way, the Talmud,
I saw that.
the Vilna edition of the Talmud has the same kind of thing going on. That when a verse is quoted, it gives the thing on the side. And then the notes below are more philological notes having to do with manuscripts and translations and things like that.
Okay.
I'll bring more of this in the future. And when we get to the Samson material, there'll also be a lot of really interesting stuff here. So you can find Pseudo-Philo online. It's one of those old translations from the 19th century, probably Charles. It's interesting that Charles was the old editor of these big volumes from, I remember these huge, really expensive. I wanted to buy them when I was at Hebrew University, that had all these extra books in it. And then this new edition came out, which was also pretty expensive at the time, I remember. Probably meant it was probably like $150 for the 2 volumes, but it's invaluable. It served me well. And that's Charles Worth. So, but that's not online, what I have here, but I'll try to bring it in the future. Okay. One more thing about so there's a play on words with the Greek, with kamun and the word for furnace, but there's also in the background of our text here, which I think what we have here is actually translated from Latin, if I remember correctly. We only have it in Latin. We don't have a Greek or an Aramaic or any other language that may have come before that. But there's Hebrew in the background here, a play on words, because you notice how many times it talks about burning. Well, the word for burning is ba'ar, bo'er. So ya'ir, bo'er, ba'ar, the R thing is going on quite a bit here. And we're going to hear some more assonance or onomatopoeics, or however we are supposed to say that word. We're going to have that coming up now. So anybody have anything else they'd like to ask or say about this really interesting 3-verse long, but apparently more complicated history fellow named Yair? Okay. All right. So John, would you like to read for us?
You know what, just real
Go
quick,
ahead.
it's interesting how much was spoken about Abimelech, and then Tola and Yair just get a couple of sentences.
Right. So there, as I said, there will be 2 of these minor prophets here, meaning Tola and Yair. And then Yiftach, the next story we're going to get to it next week. Yiftach or Jephthah is a larger story, but what many of the commentators say that was planted in between to separate. And then afterwards, there's going to be 3 more minor judges. So in the end, I think that for me, the easiest way to understand these things are there were remnants of tales. There were folk tales. There were oral stories that are out there that some of them were richer than others, depending on where in the end the copy that we got of the Book of Judges was edited. That is, wherever that was, right? So it's clear that Samson takes a huge amount, right? Devorah takes a rather large amount, although it's not really so much about Devorah. There's other things going on. Yerubal, Gidon takes a Gideon is a huge amount. So I don't know much really what to make of it, other than to say either that's the material that survived, so they use more of it, or those were the more meaningful stories for the person who ended up, or the group of people that ended up editing this. More than that, a lot of scholars have tried to make a lot of things out of this. None of it really I find it terribly convincing. Okay. All right. So John, you're going to read for us?
6 through 7.
Yes, please.
The Israelites again did what was offensive to the Lord. They served the Baalim and the Ashtoreth and the gods of Aram, and the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines, who forsook the Lord and did not serve him. And the Lord, incensed with Israel, surrendered them to the Philistines and to the Ammonites.
Okay, so there's no judge mentioned here, right? But this, it's not totally foreign. The language is a little bit different, but we have this already, right? We have this constant up and down in the book of Judges, and this is a down because of the reaction of the people. Here it goes into great detail with the people who, including the Sidonites, right? All the way up there in the north, of who have influenced the Israelites. But what stands out more than anything else here, and it's not only here, but I think what stands out here is this, again, God takes it personally. God is incensed, right? This it's anthropomorphism of God, of course, but it's not, that we have that through the book here, and God takes it really personally, and we'll see just how deeply. Usually we would have this, and then God allows or brings about the punishment, and then we wait until the Israelites cry out to the Lord and they better. But here, there's a bit of a difference to it. I just want to look. Okay, so that's in the background here. Now we have more of a detail account of what this punishment looked like. So, John, why don't you go ahead and read the next section as well?
That year they battered and shattered the Israelites for 18 years, all the Israelites beyond the Jordan, in what had been the land of the Amorites in Gilead. The Ammonites also crossed the Jordan to make war on Judah, Benjamin, and the house of Ephraim. Israel was in great distress. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, "We stand guilty before you, for we have forsaken our God and served the Baalim."
Okay, so finally we get the Israelites are praying, but before that, we have this again, this play on words, the stuff with the play on words going on, that was replicated or reflected in the translation here, battered and shattered. I would add to this, if I was doing this translation, I would do that year they battered and shattered the Israelites, and skip to the end of that sentence, and Israel was greatly tattered, right? And the reason I would go for battered, shattered, and tattered is because in the Hebrew, it's v'yiratzu. So we have the rei tzadi, ratz. And then at the end, the teitzar. Again, you have the tzadi resh, play on words. I think that's all. The first two are definitely intentional, but I would say the teitzar Yisrael, and they were distressed as well. So you've got, again, the editor, at least in this section, he's riding on the wordplay, right? He's on a roll. And yeah. And then, okay, so that's in the background. Geographically, I don't have to bring up the map. Everybody just imagine the map with the Mediterranean's on this side over here, and the Jordan River is over here, and the Israelites are mostly on this side, except for some that are over here. And then they go over to this side, and the Ammonites are over here. And not only do they try expel the Gileads or the Gileadites, but also move back over the river as well. Let's say the order of Jericho, and this goes back and forth, right? But the reason that all this is great is given in great detail is to talk about the relationship between God and the people of Israel. Even though it's really only a few of the tribes in that area, what they want to talk about here again are these consequences. Yes, Susie.
Yeah, do you think there's any significance to 18 years? Finally, after 18 years, they were given life again, maybe?
Using 18 as a thing is not biblical, right? So you're thinking of high, right?
Yeah.
High is not a biblical thing. I don't know. I don't know from when it is. I don't know. I don't even know if it's from rabbinic. It's one of those things that we think of. I don't know, for the non-Jews that are amongst us here, each of the Hebrew letters of the Aleph Bet have a numerical value. So the word for life is chet yud, chai. and that is 8 and 10, meaning 18, which is why 18 is a typological number in Judaism. You will often find, if you look on a fundraiser, like a Facebook fundraiser, for those that don't do fundraising, you'll find that often Jews are giving either 18 or 36 or 72 or 104, all these kind of, well, why 100? Why not just 100, right? Why not 40? Why 36? Why not 20? I do the same. It's a way of us saying to the world, you know, it's part of the secret handshake kind of a thing in many ways, right?
Yeah.
That is kind of an interesting why we stick with that, but it's not biblical, my dear. I'm sorry. Sorry to disappoint. I don't know about the years. It's interesting. The years beforehand in the book of Judges were large rounded numbers, 70, 40. Now they're and this section, they're more they're odder numbers, which has led some scholars to say this must be more historical. It's more authentic historical with these kind of numbers. I don't know. Okay, anybody else?
I'm wondering in the 6 to 7 bit, it says they serve the Baalim and the Ashtaroth. Who are the Ashtaroth? And they don't come back at the end in 8 to 10 when they say when they're quoted there as saying we serve the Baalim, but
Good eye, good eye, Sister Claire, good eye. So the Baalim are, as we said, Baal is like Adon, so right, and there's a variety of them. The Lord of this, the Lord of that, right? For instance, many of you know, I think, do you pronounce it Beelzebub? How do you pronounce the
Beelzebub? Yeah.
Right. So that's Beelzebub, right? That's a derogatory, the Lord of the flies. That's literally what it means, right? And so in many cultures around the world, there was not only a male main deity, there was a female main deity, Ashtoreth, Astarte. These are all part of the same the him and her, the he and she gods that you have in so many polytheistic systems. And there were those in the feminism of the 60s, some of the feminist theology of the 60s came out accusing our tradition of pushing away the feminine deity, and many people see in any kind of worship or semi-deification, I hope I mean no disrespect, semi-deification of Mary, of Mother Mary, in the same way, right? Of bringing a kind of at least from a sociological or anthropological point of view, this need, and there's something healthy in that. When I gave that course that I've told some of you about, a queer approach to the book of Genesis, that in the last year I was in Stockholm in Sweden, one of the things that I was trying to look at there too was how do we find more of the not him God in the text that we had, and where I was able to find it, or at least talk about it, was in what seems to be a far more active role of the earth herself in the creation story, and in this relationship between the first human beings and the earth, and how that worked, and then essentially the curse that Adam and Eve received from God that had a lot to do with womanhood and fertility in the earth, maybe God being jealous of the earth. I'm not saying that's a simple meaning of the text, but what I am trying to say is that a lot of people want to find those aspects. And this goes back to the comment that Sasha said, it's interesting that Dvorah, a woman, was quoted here, right? Or the comment I made about the list on the rabbinic listserv about, well, how come there's no prayers here that are written by females or by women? So Ashtoreth is part of that, but that wasn't their main. So she pops up from time to time, or the feminine aspects of the idolatrous cult pop up, but in the end, it's a man's world. They're still calling it. It's the world of the Baalim.
But is there a reason that they come up, or is it just kind of random? They just kind of come up randomly whenever.
No, it comes up because it was there, because she's there. But in the end, it's as you said, the final word doesn't mention her, right?
Right.
Right.
Because there's other places as well in other scriptures where it's Baal and Baalim. But this Ashtoreth thing, it doesn't.
Right. So there are more Ashtoreths. If you look up Ashtor or Astarte, right? By the way, the interesting thing about the book of Esther is that the two main characters, who are super Jews, right? Mordechai and Esther, they have super pagan names. Mordechai from Marduk, and Marduk was the Babylonian chief head honcho god, and
Okay.
Esther, Astarte, was the chief head honcho goddess. So yeah, so that's an interesting, so you will find Ashtoreth. You'll
Okay.
find it, but you'll find much more about the Baalim. I don't think that I'm guessing in reality you had just as much, because I'm guessing women had a lot to do with worshiping someone closer to their heart, perhaps. Yeah.
John, I think.
Yes, John, please.
I'm wondering if the use of the two words, or even when they're separate, just one or the other, through much of the biblical writing, are they not sometimes just used as generic for pagan gods in general?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Right. And what tells you, yeah, what gives it away, of course, is that the words are in the plural.
Yeah.
Is that the case here? It's usually the
Yeah,
Baalim
yeah.
Ashtoreth, but
Yeah.
here, yeah, I lost it. Where is it?
They're both in the plural. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That of course, that's the dead giveaway that it's generic. Okay. So not an expertise though, but I'm sure you can find a lot on Ashtoreth. Look up Astarte or Ashtoreth. You'll find a lot on the web. All right then. Anything else? Okay, so the people are battered and shattered and greatly tattered. Michael, you want to read 11:14?
Sure. But the Lord said to the Israelites, I have rescued you from the Egyptians, from the Amorites, from the Ammonites, and from the Philistines. The Sidonians, Amalek, and Maon also oppressed you, and when you cried out to me, I saved you from them. Yet you have forsaken me and have served other gods. No, I will not deliver you again. Go cry to the gods you have chosen. Let them deliver you in your time of distress.
This is a bit surprising, right? We're not used to God being such a hard ass.
No.
Usually they, okay, all right, okay, I'll forgive you, but no, sarcasm. God answers with sarcasm. Go, no, you want gods? Take them, go do with it.
So this is the first time that this happened.
I don't know if it's the first time. I haven't checked. It seems to be, it does stand out though. In all the texts that we've ever read about God being angry with the people of Israel, this one seems particularly sarcastic.
So this is the origin of Jewish sarcasm?
Well, certainly an early testimony to that. Yeah. Origin, I'm guessing, would probably go back to origin would be Cain and Abel saying, "Am I my brother's keeper?"
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know the origin. Anyway, so there's a choser hatama. It doesn't fit exactly the people whom God has saved the people from. For instance, in the section beforehand, there was nothing about Egyptian paganism, Egyptian religion, but it's brought in here possibly because that's just common. So I have saved you from the Egyptians. That is so common as a theme that it may have just it just rolled off of the tongue or the pen, or the quill of the writer here, because there's nothing about the Egyptians in this particular section here. Okay. Any other questions or comments?
But whenever God tells them that he saved the Jews, he always begins with the Egyptians.
Well, I think that's it. I think that's why, even though it doesn't fit this story, right? But yes, yeah, I think so. That's the tashtit. That's the foundation of it. Okay. All right then. So Claire, would you read 15:16 for us?
But the Israelites implored the Lord, we stand guilty. Do to us as you see fit. Only save us this day. They removed the alien gods from among them and served the Lord. and he could not bear the miseries of Israel.
Okay, now this is so finally, okay, we see okay, it all worked out. It's all nice, happy ending for everybody. But this is a strange one here. This could not bear the miseries of Israel. The word here, first of all, if you for those that know the Hebrew, v'tiktsar nafsho, I think that tiktsar, that God, it literally means and God's breath was shortened. In other words, he lost patience, God lost patience. Or in this case, could not bear, couldn't take it any longer. We'll get to the word ba'amal yisrael in a second, but tiktsar, I think that is a continue of the play on words that we had beforehand. V'yiratzu, v'yirotzatzu, v'teitzar, that tsar, the tzadi reish kind of thing, v'tiktsar. Amal is a word that later on became a word for labor, for hard work. And it's used in about the slaves as we were slaves in Egypt. But hard work and suffering are very similar from a semantic point of view. The whole thing is a little bit strange, though. In other words, it anthropomorphizes God even more than beforehand. Right? God, yeah. It's just and this seems to be a unique way of saying it. In other cases, and God he had mercy upon them. God had whatever, and here it makes it far more emotional. That's a very it's hard for me to think of another case like this. There may be, but I can't think of another biblical situation like this where it makes God so so personal, right? Or so human, of course. Yeah. Okay, why don't you read, Claire? Why don't you read the end as well? The end, by the way, is actually the introduction to the next section. It's at the end of the chapter here, but we could have easily put out these two verses off for next week. But let's go ahead, because while it's the end of one, while it's the beginning of the new story, it's also the end of this. Go ahead, Claire.
The Ammonites mustered, and they encamped in Gilead, and the Israelites massed, and they encamped at Mizpah. The troops, the officers of Gilead, said to one another, "Let the man who is the first to fight the Ammonites be chieftain over all the inhabitants of Gilead."
All right, so this is the leitmotif here. We need a leader. In the stories we had today, the first was called Moshiach, a deliverer. Second was called, the word shafat was used, a judgment. So whether it's a deliverer, a judge, political leader, a judicial function, whatever it might be, the idea that we're getting from at least the way that the book of Judges has been edited is that the people are flying around. They're leaderless. They need a strong leader. They need some good leadership. And perhaps this is a way for us to introduce the next section about Yiftach, which is going to be some difficult stuff as well, but it's also a way for us to return to our semi-prayer or prayer at the beginning of this session, that these kinds of texts help open up our eyes to how we live our lives as individuals, but also how we live our lives as communities, and how we as Jews certainly live our lives in a constant relationship with our brothers and sisters in Israel, but also with all of humanity. And in this particular moment, I would say with the Palestinians as well. It's leadership. If I had to say right now which was something that I think that Israelis and Palestinians need to consider more than anything else is leadership.
Leadership.
Yeah. And what's happening on the streets, the lynching and the rioting and the violence, even in all Jewish places like Tel Aviv, we were told by our daughter a few hours ago, is it's from a vacuum. There's a vacuum, and the state of Israel has not dealt with serious leadership issues, including what to do with the Gaza Strip for years now, because of the elections, because of the case of Netanyahu, because of his struggle to stay in power and his supporters to keep him everybody with their own reasons, and the Palestinian elections being postponed, absolute dearth of leadership on their part. It's all around, and so I think we need to focus on the leadership in our own communities and to support leaders who we feel are going in the right direction, even if it has nothing to do with Israel right now. And I'll be addressing that tomorrow with a group of other faith leaders tomorrow morning, with something that has to do with the Salton Sea, and asking them to focus their efforts on what we can do as individuals, but to support our political leaders who are going in the directions we'd like them to go to, and how we might do that. So I leave everybody to their own thoughts and their own opinions on this, but we shall end with Oseh Shalom Bimromav Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu Val Kol Yisrael Val Kol Yoshvei Tevel. May the one who makes order and peace and wholeness in the heavens above us enable us to find the way to do so here on earth, not only amongst ourselves and our own community, not only when it comes to all of Israel as the Jewish people, but all of Israel as humanity, those who continue to struggle, indeed, for all those living on this earth. And let us say Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Again.
Everybody, we have a number of things going on that I'd like you to pay attention if you are so minded. Other than the study, we have a lot. We're coming into a time of greater activism when it comes to refugees, asylum seekers that have started to come across the lines again. I'll be putting out something tomorrow in our email about how you can contribute, how we can contribute to help those that are in transit, like we were a few years ago. That's picking up again. And we will be talking soon about how we can help some of the unincorporated communities closer to the Salton Sea live their lives with dignity and health in light of the great pollution, air pollution and water pollution. Those are things that are coming up soon, so please keep your ears open. Again, this young man is looking for housing for Monday and Tuesday. I spoke about it before. If you want more, if you're able, you have a casita or some place where you can rent out the room, he can pay a modest rental fee for 2 nights a week for a 3-month period while he interns in Palm Springs City. And in general, let's be in touch, okay? Thanks, everybody. Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.